It's interesting news, and it wouldn't ordinarily, to me at least, be a story at all if it wasn't for the fact that 8 months into an administration, you have Keir Starmer beating Boris Johnson as the preferred choice for PM. They've narrowed the Tory lead to just 2 points this week as support for Johnson and the Conservatives has dropped after the government's handling of exam results. That surprises me because that is a story, important as it is, that is very much focused on a few people in the grander scale. The YouGov poll found that public support for the Tories dropped by 4 points to 40%, while Labour was up 3 to 38% from the week before survey. So Keir Starmer is now the preferred choice of Prime Minister, with Labour leader ratings rising 3 points to 35. And on that point, the reason to Disney boy and Barry White, who texted the real people apparently, it doesn't sound like it, does it? The reason it's significant is it's quite hard to put the genie back in the bottle at that point. I can't imagine that at some point in the next 4 years, Keir Starmer's ratings are going to be at 3%. Boris Johnson's personal rating slipped a point to 31 after the PM refused to sack Gavin Williamson over the handling of the A-levels. Should the Tories change direction, or do they do the unthinkable and change their leader? In a moment, Tom Harwood, senior reporter at Guido Fawkes. First, Luke Akehurst, Secretary of Labour first. Afternoon to you, Luke. Good to have you with us. What has gone wrong, as far as you can ascertain, for the Conservatives? I'm sure it's a big old answer you've got ready for us.
Well, it's basically about competence. Even if people aren't particularly personally affected, they don't have children or grandchildren doing GCSEs or A-levels, they can just see these remarkable kind of U-turns happening, and it looked like Gavin Williamson wasn't really conscious of the likely impact of the algorithm. They didn't seem particularly cited on it, even when it went wrong in Scotland a week before. The UK government was very slow to react about the English exam results, and then the general context is kind of favourable to the centre-left because we've got a situation with COVID which plays to the ideology of the centre-left. It's a public health crisis, so everything about investment in the NHS and public health matters. It's an economic crisis, so everything that the centre-left would always say about intervening in the economy to save jobs matters. It's not really a comfortable zone for a quite right-wing Conservative government to be in because their fundamental belief set is about fairly minimal government, and this is a crisis where everyone just on wants the government to help.
Just to cut in for a second on this point, Luke, I mean, what's been interesting about this government is that they have acted in quite a socialist way in terms of intervention. In fact, they've been criticised by some in the way they've responded in that respect.
Yeah, obviously the only thing that a government could do confronted with this scale of crisis is to be extremely interventionist. Whether that is going to continue is going to be interesting because when the furlough stuff ends, there's a risk of the economy falling off a cliff there. But it's kind of an uncomfortable position for people. Yeah, it's not instinctively where these kind of Conservative politicians would be coming from. This isn't the vision that Dominic Cummings had for how he wanted the country to be run.
Would it have been any different under Keir Starmer, though? That's the question, isn't it? I mean, if you look at what happened, Keir Starmer wasn't calling for an earlier lockdown. Keir Starmer supported the government and pretty much all the steps they've taken subsequently.
I think the evidence of his previous career, and earlier you described him as a career politician, is not. He was out of politics for a very long time, including serving as DPP. So he was at the head of a very large public sector organisation, used to dealing with things based on expert advice and careful consideration rather than kind of knee-jerk ideological approach. And I would like to believe that if he had access to the expert advice at the points in time that Boris did, that he would have been more on the ball, more focused, just more assiduous, and more likely to have reacted earlier to. We're talking about differences of days or weeks, but in the early stages of the spread of the virus, a different say of locking down a week earlier might have saved.
Yeah, but I mean that was a Sage Committee decision, of course, unanimous before they became controversial and found themselves embedded into all sorts of political arguments. I mean, the government of the day simply went by the advice of that committee. Let's bring Tom Harwood in, senior reporter at Guido Fawkes. I mean, Tom, it sounds early doors to start talking about replacing a prime minister, but it seems extraordinary to me that for the first time in over a decade, you've got the leader of the opposition ahead of the prime minister when it comes to who you'd prefer to see as PM. I mean, that should be a warning shot for the Tories.
I mean, to some extent it should be, but we are in danger here of sort of looking at the particulars too much and forgetting the big picture. We've had 10 years of Conservative-led government in this country. And if we look back historically over the various parties mid-term as we are now, especially mid-crisis, it's actually quite unusual for a party to still be ahead. And let's not forget the Conservative Party is still ahead, miraculously, of the Labour Party. Even William Hague was ahead of Blair's Labour Party at one point during the fuel crisis. Even Michael Foot was ahead of Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party in 1982. I mean, this is a perfectly normal thing that we should expect to happen mid-term. The time where people should be worried about leadership or polls like this is in the 6 or 8 months before a general election. The general election is 4 years away. So I think this is it's quite right to be having this discussion because it's a notable thing that's happened, but it's also something that we should probably expect to have happened.
I mean, we could, in one respect, Tom, I understand that we could expect it because, you know, it's a challenging time, it's a difficult time. But as I mentioned to Luke, if you consider what the government have done in terms of bailouts and loans and the furlough scheme and grants and all manner of other initiatives and, you know, eat out to help out, everything that's gone with it. I mean, you could argue no government could have done more to attempt to assist in this respect. And yet people are still, according to this poll, saying Keir Starmer would make the better prime minister.
Yes, I think there's a certain amount of inevitability around that when it comes to crisis, and this nation is in crisis. Most nations around the world are in crisis. We're facing a once-in-a-century pandemic. But let's not forget, this is basically wartime. This country has had a much more command and control structure from central government because we're fighting an all-out war against an invisible enemy, which it seems that we're winning now, but it's taken a while to get around to that, and that's obviously creating hardship for lots of people. What is interesting here, though, is that we can have a perfect comparison, if you like, between different ways that different political parties would run it. We've got this amazing comparison in the sort of semi-federal structure. I know it's not quite federal, but the devolution structure of this country. We can see what happens when Labour runs things in Wales. We can see what happens when the SNP runs things in Scotland. And we can see what happens when the DUP and Sinn Féin run things in Northern Ireland. And guess what? There isn't that much difference when it comes to things like the time of locking down, when it comes to things like how exam results are decided. All these differently striped ideological administrations came up with similar answers. So I think it's probably a bit unfair to read into the particulars of this, and people are more likely to be just hitting out against the authority in difficult times. That's perfectly natural and to be expected.
And Luke, just a point then on Keir Starmer. I mean, has he peaked too soon? Could that be a problem for Labour? He hasn't had to say very much, of course. He's been the recipient of these good numbers without having to do very much at all.
Well, I don't think that he's peaked. We're not even in the lead yet. So I'm obviously pleased that his personal ratings are above Boris Johnson's, and I kind of don't really find that surprising, given that he exudes competence and is reassuring to people in a way in which, yeah, Boris entertains people, but he's not someone that I find reassuring. I don't think the average British person in the street finds him that reassuring. But the idea, yeah, Labour clearly hasn't peaked. We've started to close the gap. I don't think we're in the midterm yet, as Tom said. We're less. Well under a year into this administration. The test will be if the economic situation does get a lot worse. I think that could be something that really reshapes public opinion in the same way that Black Wednesday did just after 92. Remember, there is a precedent for this, for the Tories winning a fourth general election and less than a year after it, losing their reputation for economic competence. And that's when people really begin to start reassessing whether they want them to stay in power.
Luke, thank you. Luke Akehurst, who's Secretary of Labour First. That's a network for Labour moderates. Tom Harwood, also senior reporter at Guido Fawkes, both with us here on Talk Radio.